Infrastructure, Lands, Border Protection, Veterans Affairs, and Procurement calls this oversight hearing to order. It is 5 p.m. on Friday, October 16, 2015. Present with me this evening is, to my right, Vice Speaker Benjamin B.J. Cruz. To his right is Senator Mary Camacho Torres, and to my left is Senator Nerissa B. Underwood. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This oversight hearing will address issues and concerns relative to the Guam Municipal Golf, Inc. lease and renewal of the lease, and that is specifically for lot 10122-12 in Dededo, also known as the Guam Municipal Golf Course, also known as Guam International Country Club. And the second part of the oversight hearing will focus on the discussion of the solicitation by the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, property lot 7163 in Yigo, also known as Lajuna, for commercial leasing. Notice of this public hearing was provided to senators, stakeholders, and the local media in a 5-day notice on October 8, 2015, and a 48-hour notice was provided on October 14, 2015, thus meeting the requirements of the open government law. This oversight hearing is also being broadcast on local television. Starting the oversight hearing here, we would first look at the issue on the renewal of the lease of the Guam Municipal Golf Course. So many names to it, I forgot. It's lot 10122-12, and this is the area here, which consists, it's a parcel of about 200 acres. Right here is Route 1. In this area here is where the old Dededo transfer station is. This is where the GPA power station, and then all these surrounding areas here are housing areas in Dededo. I believe this is the Gura. This is the Gura housing subdivision here. So what we'll be discussing tonight is this 200-acre parcel of property. This property was authorized 25 years ago in 1989 by the legislature to be leased for a period of 50 years. At that time, in 1990, a lease was entered into for a period of 25 years with an option to renew. So what we're going to look at tonight are 3 points. One was a question of, did the tenant comply with the lease agreement that was entered into in 1990 to merit renewal? The second question is, should the lease have been renewed? And the third question is the annual rent, and did the Chamorro Land Trust Commission get the best deal? I should point out that the lease was renewed in April 1st, 2014. So before we go further, I'm going to go ahead and ask the Executive Director of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, I guess in that capacity tonight, Mr. Mike Borja, to respond to the questions that we have. And I also want to recognize the presence of members of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission. We have Mrs. Amanda Santos, a sitting member of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, Mr. Pascual Sablan, a sitting member of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, Mr. David Matanani, whose appointment packet has been received by the legislature and is awaiting to undergo confirmation hearing and subsequent confirmation by the legislature. So at this point, I would like to ask Mr. Borja, unless somebody from the unless and anybody that you want to accompany you up here. And so, Mr. Borja, if you identify yourself for the record and who's the individual that's with you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, Senators. My name is Michael Borja. I'm the Administrative Director for the Chamorro Land Trust Commission and the Director of the Department of Land Management. With me tonight is Kristen Finney, the Assistant Attorney General and our legal counsel for the Chamorro Land Trust Commission.
Okay. So what I would like to do, and I also want to recognize Senator James Spaldon for joining us tonight. Thank you very much. So on the issue of the renewal of the lease for the golf course, I would like to issue, in the order that they're listed, the questions. And so the first question was, did the tenant comply with the lease agreements to merit renewal? And so with that, there's really three sub-questions that need to be answered. One, who is the current lessee? Because the company that signed the lease in 1989 was the Guam Municipal Golf Course, and the president was Mr. Gus Gogui. The company that signed the lease agreement on 2014 is a different company, and I guess it's the Guam International Country Club. It's a subsidiary of some Japanese firm. So that would be the first question with regards to the renewal of the lease agreement. Did the tenant comply with the lease provisions? The second question is the tenant's performance on the lease, and the third is the submittal of reports. So let me just kind of go over some of the findings briefly go over the findings of the committee based on the information that was provided. So with respect to the current lessee, next slide, please. No. That's not the... Can you turn the light on, please? With regard to the question of who is the current lessee, in a July 29, 2013 commission meeting, the previous administrative director recommended that the lease be continued so that the tenant can recoup the investment. And specifically, it was stated the tenant spent millions of dollars to purchase the lease. In a December 19th, 2013 commission meeting, and this is from the minutes of the meetings, the chief planner stated that Guam International Country Club is the second, or he wasn't sure how far down the line, but it's not the original lessee. And so that then begs the question of, was there legislative approval for the assignment of the lease? So I think we should just go ahead and answer that question first, if you can, Mr. Borja.
I'm not sure.
Just to put some perspective on this, Mr. Chairman, if memory serves me right, were you not the chairman of the commission in 14?
I was the acting chairman.
How long have you been on the commission?
I was on for 3 years.
So you've been on since 2011?
Yes, sir.
So all of these discussions in 13 and 14, you were chairman of the board?
I was a member. I was a commission member.
And the administrative director that the chairman refers to was sitting in the room, isn't he?
No. The administrative director at that time was Mr. Monty Mofness.
Correct.
And the minutes reflected you as the acting chairman.
In 2013, but not
Correct.
in 2011.
No,
But
in
2014. How about 2014 when the...
2014 I was.
And how could you not know who the...
Well, my assumption was that the the lessee was the same company. We were under that assumption. That's what I was working with. I didn't have the full details of it, but that's what we were working with. So, how did it go for an assignment was the question. I don't believe it did. I don't think it did. So, was there legislative approval for assignment of change? I'm not sure. If that would have happened, it would have happened well before I took over.
What was the information or advice given to the commission members at both of those meetings as to who the lessee was? Did the commission do due diligence to determine who it was?
I believe the administrative director at the time tried to do his best to do due diligence for us to give us that advice.
And were any questions raised as to who it was? I mean, obviously, whoever was in front of you was obviously not Gaskogui.
Companies change hands, and that's the issue here. The company the shares of the company got bought out. The company we believe, I believe today, stayed the same company, but the ownership of that company had changed hands with shareholder buyouts.
And what is the requirement of the Chamorro Land Trust as to who can lease land? And what were the terms of the original lease? And was the original lease intended for a Chamorro corporation that had the lease? And was there any provision in the lease that allowed for the assignment of the sale of those shares and to continue to keep the lease?
This lease was a result of a public law. There were no rules and regulations for the Chamorro Land Trust Commission because this lease was a creation of a public law that was under the control eventually of the Department of Land Management and then passed on over to the Chamorro Land Trust Commission when it was created.
Okay, let me just bring some clarification. You are correct. It was a public law in the 19th legislature that authorized the 50-year leasing of this tract of land, the golf course. And when the lease for that first 25-year period was entered into, on page 6, paragraph 7 of the lease, it states specifically, the lessee shall not sell, assign, sublease, or otherwise transfer its interest in the property without prior consent of the governor and the legislature. Any attempted alienation of interest in the property without such prior consent shall be void. And so, so that's why the question is being asked: who is this current lessee? And because it's not clear. I mean, I take it you're not clear either. If Guam Municipal Golf Course, which signed the lease in 1989, is the same under the name of Gus Gogui, if that is the same company that has signed the next 25 years.
No, it is not.
They're not the same company.
Well, I mean, it's different owners of the same company. The company has remained the same. It's just different shareholders in that company that have assumed it over.
Okay.
That's my impression of what has happened in this lease.
Okay. So can the Chamorro Land Trust then provide to the committee at a later time the documentation to support that in fact the current signator to the lease is basically the same company as the one that signed it 25 years ago?
We'll get that information for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can we also provide the committee with copies of any approval by any prior governor or legislature approving the assignment or the transfer?
We'll search the records for that.
Yeah. Okay, so then that was, that basically concludes the first question of who is this current lessee. The second question with regards to the issue of did the tenant comply with the lease agreements to merit renewal was the tenant's performance on the lease. Now, the hold on a second. With regard to that question, in a July 29, 2013 CLTC meeting, the tenant was described by the previous administrative director as historically been always delinquent. As of the end of the lease in February of 2014, there was still $74,000 in arrears. And during the course of the lease, the 25-year lease, the arrears sometimes at one time got as high as $800,000. And in addition to that, information shows that the tenant, at least as of February of 2014, had a $52,000 property tax delinquency. In addition to that, with respect to his performance with a contract, the lease agreement specifically requires that annual reports are to be filed. It specifically states, the lessee shall annually submit to the Department of Land Management a financial statement and report setting forth in detail the use, improvements, and income derived from the property. This was one of the items that the committee had requested from the Chamorro Land Trust Commission, but we didn't receive any. I can only assume that there was none on file. I did receive information that I guess many years ago, the Department of Land Management at the time gave an outline of what it wanted in the report. One of them was how many local residents use the golf course, how many tourists use the golf course. Certainly a financial statement would have been, but apparently there's none on file. So then these are some of the issues that kind of, point out as to what was the tenant's performance on the lease. So can you respond to that?
As I have provided to the committee, I did give you the summary of all the rentals and where they stand financially as far as payments go, and they are current as of October 2015. Now, leading up to this lease, the previous lease, the original lease before renewal, yes, it was, as you stated in that minutes, there was some concern about this organization and their payments. And when it came up to the time for their renewal, I too was concerned, but they became current on their rental. And because they were current on all this on their rental, and from what we understood at the time as well of their property taxes, and there's some questions about that, but we had no other recourse, because that's what the lease said, is that if they were current and they gave us the option to renew, that we were obligated to have to accept that option to renew. And I had questioned that during the time I was a commissioner, because they did have a problem with payment of their rent. Now, just to let you know that during this time too, the economy of Guam had taken a major slam, and when their customer base, who was not only local but also tourist related, it was difficult for them to make the kind of monies they needed in order to stay afloat. That's a pretty large property to take care of as well. So there were some issues, and it wasn't just the Guam golf course. There were all the golf courses on Guam that were going through that process, and you saw changes in ownership in all the golf courses on Guam because of that problem that happened. So there was a problem, and we knew that. We talked about it, but when the time came for renewal, they came current.
Okay, and I understand. So if we can just go ahead and to the next slide, Peter. the question then of the term of the renewed lease. Now, the lease was renewed for a term of 25 years. This is the last 25 years of the authorization. And and given what we have pointed out about the tenant's performance, and yes, it may have had problems because of the economy and whatever else, it kind of begs the question, should that lease have been renewed for a term of 25 years, or maybe for shorter terms with options to renew? It was shown that they were often in arrears during the first 25 years, but when they became aware that the lease was up for renewal, obviously that motivated them to come current on a lot of their lease payments and whatnot, which seems to be that maybe if the lease was renewed for shorter terms, then there's that leverage that you gotta come current, otherwise we won't renew the lease. But so I need to understand what was the rationale for going the full 25 years. And in fact, even the previous administrative director had suggested that maybe the lease be renewed for shorter terms with more options to renew versus one 25-year term.
The law and the lease, as it was originally created, didn't give us those options. And without any rules and regulations for commercial use, we also didn't have any other options except to do whatever the language in the lease allowed us to do. They didn't give us the options to try and come up with other options, and so that's why we had to stay with the 25 years. Now, you wanted to know on the lease performance, given on the lease performance. So after we had signed that lease and their performance again began to slip as they were beginning to look for again, a new shareholder to come on in, we again looked at the possibility of holding them in default. But we worked with them on a regular basis just to see where they were going on this process in getting a new owner to be able to come current on their rent. Because if I defaulted, and I was kind of also being very optimistic about the possibility of having rules and regulations in place by then for commercial use, then I would have the opportunity to be able to take that golf course and try to find a new lessee for it. But absent any rules and regulations, if I defaulted on them, then the whole golf course would become stale, and I couldn't use it for anything else. It would sit idle, and I would probably end up having to come up with the money from our own funds just to keep the grass cut if we wanted to maintain it as a golf course. So that was the options that we had. Fortunately, they were able to find a new owner or a new set of shareholders, and they came current on everything again. And so, still without rules and regulations, if I held them in default and I seized and terminated the contract and took control of all the assets, all the building assets, everything that has to stay there, I'd be left with I'd be having to subdivide it into agricultural lots is the best thing I could do, because I couldn't come out and do anything else if I didn't have any kind of commercial rules to be able to do anything else with it.
How many acres is this?
200.
You say that your only choice would have been agricultural.
Or residential.
What, you didn't say residential. I was going to ask. It would seem to me that the golf course, if anything, had all the infrastructure. I mean, it has better watering system and better water system than any place else on the island to keep itself green. Was there any discussion about taking it back and using 200 acres for residential, which would have satisfied 400 applicants?
Yeah, we had taken a look at doing something like that, but then just to subdivide it and parcel out half-acre lots because I still can't put in the sewer lines. You'd be taking a pristine
I
area
understand, but I'm just
and turning
saying-
them into ranches.
Where this whole push for trying to get as much land commercially leased to raise money to put in infrastructure, we had a 200-some acre piece that had water, had power because they had lights, could have been turned into 400 parcels.
Sure.
And what, was there any discussion in the commission about using it for that purpose? We keep complaining about the fact that we don't have any property for residential. We had a
Senator.
200-acre piece that would and could have been, since all the golf courses were going down for the economic reasons, turned it into something else and satisfy people that have been waiting 20 years now.
The highest and best use of that 200 acres was to try and use it in the exact same condition as it was created and being used as a golf course. So we were trying to look to see if we could still obtain rent by using it as a golf course for the time being. I mean, to turn it into 200 lots or 400 lots, yes, that's a possibility. But that's not what we were looking at as the highest and best use of that property as it was. This golf course was by law designed so that it could provide an affordable golf facility for the local population. This golf course provides the only golf course on this island for our local youth to do, and the junior golf associations to be able to do their golfing here on the island so that the schools can have a place to play intramural golf. This is the only golf course that has that ability and is performing that function at this time.
And what independent knowledge do you have of that fact, but for the fact? Did they provide annual reports that would have shown that?
Going to that question, no, sir, they did not. And that is a situation which I find, I'll take the hit on, but it is something we'll be working on.
And so how and where do you get the information that you just spouted about?
That they're doing junior golf account? Because I know they're doing that. They've told us, they've come to us specifically asking us, the different golf association leagues who help sponsor the junior golf came to our commission meetings asking us to give consideration for a lease renewal for this purpose. I know that they did some modifications to help with having a par 3 golf course section so that they can have the little children who are learning to play golf have an area to play golf as well.
That was discussed in, I believe it was the December 2013 Chamorro Land Trust Commission meeting when the chief planner came in to explain that. But that was when he also had mentioned that the challenge we have here is, we're now in about the third generation of the lessee. He is that the lessee that we have now was not the original lessee. And that was but it was discussed about the par 3 golf, area to accommodate the junior golfers. Now, the next question on the is the annual rent, and the question of did the Chamorro Land Trust Commission get the best deal? Now, in the first 25 years, the land was that 200 acres was appraised at $1.4 million. That was 24 years ago, and that was actually on the low side. And it was very clear in the lease documents that the $1.4 million was arrived at because it also took into consideration all the infrastructure and the buildings that were going to be built and all that. And so they valuated it at $1.4 million and set the rent at 10% of that land valuation, which was the first the first 25 years, it escalated. In the lease agreement, it showed a certain annual lease amount for every 5-year segment. And then in this second 25 years of the lease renewal, what's interesting is that the 1980 land valuation was used to determine basically what the annual leases would be for the next 25 years. So in 2014, the Department of Revenue and Taxation conducted a land assessment of all the properties on Guam, and that same property in the year 2014 was now valuated at $6.4 million. It appreciated about $5 million over a 25-year period. Now, the new lease that has been entered into used the 1989 land valuation, and so the projected revenue over the next 25 years would be $8 million. But if the most current land valuation was used, the total revenue over the next 25 years would have been $19.8 million, a difference of $11.8 million. Maybe if you can elaborate on that.
Again, I didn't have the options to do that. I'm stuck with the lease that was mandated to the Chamorro Land Trust Commission without those options to be able to go into that. It just told us every 5 years you had to increase, I believe, 10%.
I believe the lease agreement stated that the lease would be renewed under the same terms with the exception of the annual rent. But nowhere does it say that you had to stay with the 1989 land valuation versus using the 2014, the most current. I mean, basically, I just didn't read that in the lease.
And that was part of the discussion as we went through the process of trying to come up with Chamorro Land Trust rules and regulations for commercial use, that we would be, lease renewals would be also based on whatever the current valuation is and not on the originals when we made those kinds of changes in our previous discussions here. And so these kinds of discussions in the lease, and that's the only thing I had to base anything on, was what the original lease was created from. I didn't have any other kinds of documentation or rules or law to be able to fall back on to go beyond that.
And I guess, I don't know, I mean, does legal counsel have anything to add? I didn't read anything that says you cannot, in the next 25 years forward, then use the current appraisal of the property, and then from that come up with the lease, the annual lease payments. I just don't see that in the lease. Trying to find a specific section that says. So, actually in paragraph 1 of the original lease, on page 2 of the original lease, it reads, the lease shall be for a term beginning on February 1, 1989 and ending on January 31st, 2014. That's 25 years, with an option to renew the lease for another 25 years upon the same terms and conditions contained in this lease, excepting the payment of rent, which shall be adjusted every 5 years, as stated in paragraph 2. So, when we first started with this 25 years ago, the methodology that was used was, what is the current appraised value? And they took 10% of that and they said, that's the point of departure. And then every 5 years it was increased by 10%. And so under the new lease, that we basically continued to use the 1989 valuation 25 years ago, and continued then just increase the rent by another 10%. But I just don't see anything in the lease that said that the Chamorro Land Trust couldn't sit down and say, look, this land is now worth $6.4 million.
But as it says in that first paragraph, under the same terms and conditions is what you're subject for the renewal.
Excepting the payment of rent.
But that it would go up every 5 years at 10% per year.
You start from the fair market value on 16. I mean on 2, on page 2.
Yeah, the methodology that was used was basically whatever the land valuation was then. It was the land value was $1.4 million, and they took 10%, and that was then the rent for the first 5 years. And then they increased that by 10%, and increased it by 10% every 5 years for the next 25 years. So basically, the basis for the rent was based on the land valuation. I just don't see anything in here that says that, you know, you could not use the current land valuation. I didn't see anything in here that says you had to stay with 25 years later, you had to stay with the 1989 land valuation.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
Mr. Borja, one of the reasons why I believe, at least back in the day, that we set this law and allowed the municipal golf course, and I think if we turn to page 6 on item number 8, is basically, it basically states, to ensure affordable rates and adequate access to Guam residents, tenant shall establish a schedule of fees and preferential course reservation periods for reasonable accommodation to reasonably accommodate the demand of Guam residents from golf facilities. And I guess it has, I see this portion, I'm trying to figure out whether it really folds into even some of the considerations that the board may have made at the time. Because even if we do say that you could have raised the rent to reflect as the base the 2014 appraisal, that 6-point-something million, I would imagine that the spirit of this lease was really still intact in terms of having an affordable golf course to which locals could access. The question now becomes then, first of all, does the present management have that fee schedule that affords reasonable rates to our local golfers?
I couldn't answer that question because I do not know their fee schedule, but I do know that with their intent and with their ability and with their actual performance of allowing the junior golfers there, I mean that they're going there because they have no other alternative. When the Nimitz Golf Course was closed, that was where they were going before. And then, as we were going through this process for the renewal, we had lot of individuals who were very active in the golf associations on Guam asking us to please give them the opportunity to be renewed because they were going to be providing the activity for the junior golfers. And that's how they're keeping it affordable, I suppose. But these kids don't have free, they do have to pay a fee to be able to golf there somehow.
Right.
But it's you
Well,
have to make sure it's affordable.
Mr.
too
Burr,
for
I
them.
guess the connection I'm trying to make here is that if we had gone with the 2014 valuation on the property to see what kind of return, and I'm just kind of trying to look at the other side, then the possibility may have been that the fee schedule for local residents would have had to increase to the point that they were the same as in any private golf course. And that's really not the purpose of a municipal golf course, because really one of the mandates here says it has to be priced in accordance of affordability that other municipal golf courses throughout the country have set for their local residences. And I'm just wondering, was that ever perhaps discussed in one of your meetings in taking a look at the setting of the lease?
In that specific sense, probably not. But I mean, we did look at, that was the idea, was to try to keep them affordable. That was the request upon our commission at the time. And you're right, they would have been pricing themselves, and pricing a lot of people. They'd be just as probably as expensive in their fee schedules as other golf courses on the island. But
and thank
but
you. I
that's
just
what we're trying
was
to do.
kind of wondering if that factored in, because again, we are talking about a municipal golf course as opposed to a private golf course. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The problem that I have with that is that's pure conjecture. Without fulfilling the requirement of the lease to provide annual reports evidencing the number of locals and tourists and charges, it's conjecture. And did the commission believe and its council believe that there was a default provision in this original lease that they could have retaken the course? And was there any discussion about it?
Yes, we did have discussion about this. And we looked at it because of their rent. The rent, that when they were in default by greater amounts, by significant amounts, we did have discussions with them, and with our commissioners, within the commission, and then also with the golf course. But I had to look at what was in the best interest as well. Was it better to have a sick bird in the hand or two in the bush? And it was one of these issues where, without any other alternative for the use of the golf course as a golf course, because I couldn't, if I defaulted on this lease, that was the end of it. I couldn't go back and get another. I couldn't go find someone else on the terms of this lease because this nullified everything. I'd have to start fresh with a whole new process going through the RFP. Now, there were people in the winds waiting to come on board, but it was all contingent upon rules and regs at the time. So we were anticipating the possibility of having to use our to go into to declare this into default and to try to keep the golf course active. But I wasn't entertaining any offers because I had no rules. Although some did come forward offering that possibility. And then when they were able to come forward with being able to renew or come current on all their rents, that whole concept, the whole idea just went away, and I still had no rules to be able to go forth on anything. But I mean, that's not to say today if I had rules and regulations and they were having some problems and we were getting into the same situation again, I'd be in a better place to exercise my options to use the default clauses. Because I could then still use the golf course facility as a golf course. But I'd be able to use those rules and go through the process that it allows me to find a new lessee.
the fact that was recognized, well, this was probably around early 2014, 2013, probably, that you had people in the wings, and while it's true that there was no rules and regs in place to have allowed you to go out and do commercial leases, there's really go ahead.
In my legal counsel next to me, she's done more transactional than I could ever. But if on page 2 at the bottom, there's actually a provision there for retaking of the property. Well, bottom of page.
Exactly. We knew that we had the ability to take the property back and
So you
hold them
didn't
in
need
default.
rules and regulations. You had the lease agreement that said how
I could take it, but I couldn't go beyond that.
But
I could
still
take
to
it.
exercise
Yes,
it.
we could have held it in default and taken and seized all the assets. We knew that we had and that was what we talked about too with the lessee, that this was the possibility that would occur, and that this was to help prompt them along as well. But I couldn't renew or find another operator of the golf course based on this public law and this lease, because now we were under a whole new set of laws. Because it was now under the Chamorro Land Trust, and this public law that allowed it was was only for this lease and for this purpose, and now it's expired. It's gone. So if this thing had expired and was only good for 25 years, I'd be probably seeking either legislation to find to be able to still use it as a golf course, or hope that I had rules and regs that we can then fall into that category to try and get a new lessee for the golf course.
I'm just a little bit concerned, Mr. Bora, because we seem to be focused on leasing the property as our primary intent, but I think we need to go back to the primary spirit of the law that established the land trust in the first place. That land was leased so that it can generate funds, but at the end of the day, our priority is to make sure that the land, if they defaulted, we could have taken that back, and as Vice Speaker had noted, the infrastructure is in place, and you have 400 families that are waiting, and that could have then fulfilled the spirit of the law, which was to set aside residential and or agricultural properties for the Chamorro people. So when we get caught up with the legalities here, I get really kind of disheartened, because we know what this was intended to be in the first place.
No, ma'am. This golf course was set up by public law to be a golf course. It only came under the control of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission when the Chamorro Land Trust Commission was created. And the Chamorro Land Trust had to abide by a public law that allowed for 50 years use of a piece of property for a purpose of a golf course that was set in 25 years terms with an option to renew for another 25 years. So the Chamorro Land Trust Commission in this is just an actor executing a public law with a lease that it was given, and that's the only provisions we had. Now, to turn it into that, would it have been the highest and best use for the Chamorro Land Trust Commission? It was already a golf course. Millions of dollars has already been poured into it. The value of that property would not be $6.4 million today, most likely. It would be probably much less. But it would also mean that there would be a lot of infrastructure development that would have to go into place. Water exists there as faucets to the sprinkler system, not as lines going out to residential units. Electricity exists there to the clubhouse. And if we put people out there, we'd still be in the same situation where they'd be paying $5,000 a power pole to lay out their power. Then they'd be paying whatever GWA is charging for a 6-inch water line to their house. So the spirit of this was because we had legislation, a public law that created this golf course, And the Chamorro Land Trust Commission had nothing to do with this golf course at its creation. It was just a child that was given to us to take care of. And that's what we've been trying to do faithfully.
But they
I'm sorry that
defaulted.
I differ with you, ma'am. But that's...
They defaulted. Then the Chamorro Land Trust Commission would have then been able to take care of that land and dispose of it based on the primary intent of the Chamorro Land Trust. They defaulted. And the way I look at it, you know, when we, they had demonstrated that they were late in turning in their reports, they were late with their rent, they were not good tenants. Then they said, oh my gosh, you know, we're about to lose this land, or we're about to renew, and so they hurried up and they made good in the last minute, and we made accommodations, not even to the best value. If we had the heart of protecting the land and getting the best use of the land for the people, then we would have been a little bit more careful about making sure that we leased it for a higher amount just so that we can get the most out of it. That's all I have.
With respect to the golf course, I think, go back to those three questions. No, with respect to the golf course, those were actually the three, the one before that. With respect to the golf course, the lease having been renewed, these were really the three questions that I wanted to have responded to basically, respond to the question of, in my mind, I think the lease should have been renewed. It was a question of, should it be 25 years, or should it be shorter terms for a total of 25 years? The annual rent, there was nothing that I saw in the lease that suggests that we have to stay with the 1989 land valuation. And granted, it may be true that if we were to use the 2014 land valuation, the cost of using the golf course up there would have been out of reach of many of the local golfers. But I believe there was still room for negotiation there to get more rent out of that. And really, given the tenant's performance on the lease for the first 25 years, whoever that lessee is, I think that warranted taking a look at shorter terms versus one long term. So those are the concerns that I have with the renewal of the lease for the golf course. And so if you have any closing remarks that you want to make on that, you're welcome to make it. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next topic.
No, sir, I have no other comments.
Okay,
Thank you.
All right, so then the next topic we're going to take a look at is on the question of the Lajuna. Go back to the graphic. This is the Lajuna area. And just to give you oriented, this here is Route 15. And if we stay on that Route 15, it goes up to the back gate of Anderson. Down here is the Raceway Park. Over here is a quarrying operation with, I believe, IBC. And this area here that is outlined is the area of 400 acres that represents Lot 7163, otherwise known as Lajuna. Go to the next slide, please. And so we had sent questions to the Land Trust a couple of weeks ago, asking for a summary of the solicitation efforts that have been undertaken so far. What was the scope of the project that was described in that solicitation effort? And what was the level of interest that has been received from prospective offerers? Can you turn on the light, please? So we were able to actually get information, and I should note that it was the Guam Economic Development Authority that actually issued the the RFP on behalf of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission. And I guess that was as a result of that MOU that you guys had entered into in 2013.
Correct.
Yeah. And so the Chamorro, the Guam Economic Development Authority actually issued a solicitation on November 21st, 2013. And basically the description of the scope of work the project overview was that for the master planning and site preparation, including provision of utility infrastructure of lot 7163-R1, consisting of approximately 404 acres of undeveloped property. The property has significant development potential for residential use for the beneficiaries of the Chamorro Land Trust. CLTC via GIDA intends to negotiate a development agreement for the property that allows a prospective developer to prepare the site for residential development using the proceeds of coral extraction to offset master planning, site development, and infrastructure costs. I also found out that there was 12 interested individuals or entities that had picked up copies of the solicitation package, but ended up with just 2 submitting proposals on the deadline. Now, the question that I have is, what was the authority for issuing this solicitation to enter into this commercial lease? This was back in 2013.
As the RFP mentions, this was not to enter into a commercial lease. This was to enter into a development agreement for them to take property and to develop it and terrace out the property so we can prepare it for housing subdivisions. It was not a commercial lease. It was not a commercial license. And we knew that at the time. We were looking to engage in a commercial activity with a contractor to create subdivision, terrace out the property so we can use it to build a housing subdivision eventually, and that the minerals that would be extracted would be what the developer would then use to help offset their costs, but we would also get a royalty payment from it, and that's what the RFP talks about.
So if it was not a commercial lease, which up until today, you cannot issue commercial leases until rules and regulations have been adopted, then why didn't this go forward?
Because we knew when we discussed this, GIDA came and spoke to the commissioners in a regularly scheduled meeting to talk about this whole activity, and it was a development agreement. That's what we were looking at, just to engage in somebody to come out and clear the land for us and prepare it for commercial use, and then help we can get some monies there to help put in some infrastructure. So during the process, and the solicitation went all the way through. As you mentioned, you had 2 prospective offers, and they went through the process. They were opened and found to be correct, and that they met all the requirements, and then they were evaluated. And then the evaluation came up with a first choice. And so we began discussions with the offerer of the first choice. And as we began the discussions of that, then the Chamorro Land Trust Commission things changed. The administrative director changed. I came into play at that time, and about the same time, the Chamorro Land Trust Commission again got a lawyer on staff, Ms. Kristen Finney. She had the opportunity to review what was currently in a draft phase, and at that time, under her advice, She advised us that without any rules and regulations in place, despite what we were trying to engage in, that the possibility existed that it was a commercial activity, even though the government of Guam or the Chamorro Land Trust Commission wasn't paying anybody anything, but that someone could, this commercial company would probably earn greater than $500,000. Her recommendation was to stop, and we did. We stopped everything. The draft process of the offerer just stopped, and nothing else proceeded. But we were in hopes, because concurrently the rules and regulations were being moved through in the development, and we were hoping that it would go into process and we could try and re-engage into this activity. And in that effect, we also then entered into a access agreement. And that was just to allow them to go and do some due diligence on the land, to inspect the land, to give them the legal authority to go and look at the land so they can begin doing any kind of studies that might be necessary. But then we stopped that as well, and we never fulfilled it. We terminated that. So we have done nothing as far as this solicitation request has gone. So that's where we stand today. But under the advice of counsel, she said you would need to have commercial rules and regulations in place. Even though this wasn't going to be a commercial lease, she told us to stop, and we did.
Now, this, as I understand it, this solicitation is still open.
That's correct.
Which I guess my understanding is that once rules and regs are set in place, the solicitation that was issued back in 2013 is going to be deemed to have been valid, and the contract will be awarded to whoever that first choice was as a result of that solicitation in 2013. Is that correct?
Well, because of all of this, there is a special, what is the person called? Special Assistant Attorney General? A special assistant to the Attorney General who's been assigned to this case, and that individual will then be making that determination on the solicitation and the RFP at that time, and determine whether or not it's still valid. But there's been no comment from that individual yet, but there was an individual that was the Special Attorney General assigned for this case.
Yeah. Now, of course, it raises the question of, although there were 12 entities that picked up solicitation packages, only 2 had decided at the end to submit proposals. But it begs the question of, did maybe the other 10 that did not submit because they knew that there was no authority by the Chamorro Land Trust to be able to lease out this property for the activity that was being asked for? And that maybe after rules and regs are set in place, that possibly then the solicitation should be reissued, and maybe we'll see greater level of interest.
I couldn't comment on that. I don't know who these other 10 are. I have no idea who they are. I don't know why they wouldn't. I'm assuming, well, I don't know. I mean, you can have anybody come in and that has an interest, but once they know what the details are, their interest goes away. I have no idea who these other people are or why they made a decision they did.
Okay.
Whose idea was it to offer this property, or propose that this property be offered or to be used as a terraced housing?
This was what the previous administrative director had looked upon and investigated, and then worked with Gita to also determine the feasibility of it, and then to determine whether or not a solicitation would be practical to try and pursue this, and then they presented it to the commissioners.
The only reason why I asked the question, Mr. Chairman, is that I think both of us were in the legislature, and I think Senator Espaldon was with us in the legislature at the time that there was a proposal, and it had a glossy how they were going to turn this area into this terraced, and so I'm trying to figure out whether or not this was a proposal to address a plan that somebody had brought in, or whether or not the Department of Land Management and the Chamorro Land Trust actually did due diligence to determine the feasibility of this this project. Because, Mr. Chairman, about 6 years ago, there was a pretty heavy sale by some people that were developing some property back there. I don't know. I couldn't afford it, that was for sure. I mean, they were offering lots for 6 figures, just blank. But then when all of us went and asked how much it was going to cost to run water and power on Route 15 to our properties, I mean, if I had bought, all the rest of them and all the rest of the people that were pushing this project had considerable amount of money. Not on the Lajuna property. This was on a private piece of property, but it was still on that backside. And I'm just wondering if maybe the other 10 realized that some big money people had attempted to do this and realized that it was beyond their ability to be able to afford to bring water and power in. But I'm just trying to figure out what came first, because this project sounds almost exactly like the project that was presented to us on the legislative floor at one time.
Mr. Chair, if I may just add a little bit of insight into that. And again, I would have to go back and check my own records. Back in the day when the military buildup was first announced, the way it was going, there was definitely a big need to try to understand where they were going to get coral from. And I believe that they were, in fact, at the time, Mr. Chair, I held many of the same responsibilities you hold right now. And there were a lot of studies that were done in terms of the quality of the coral that exists on Guam. Different locations have different qualities. And my understanding was the quality of that area of the coral is much better than other areas in the island. And I think that was one of the reasons why the northern part of the island around that area was being looked at. And whether it was, again, if it served a dual purpose, I think the initial purpose was to try to see if we could use that coral for the construction that was going to be coming with the military buildup, but as a secondary augmentation to the whole thing, perhaps to turn it into something more feasible, that in the end, after they query that area for that high-grade coral, then it would be terraced so that housing could then be put in. That was my understanding at the time. But the Vice Speaker is true about what he did mention about some developments going on that side of the island, but it was not on this particular piece of property. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
Mr. Bora, to point number 3, the level of interest received. The one proposer that has been determined or selected, did they put an earnest deposit down, some security deposit? Part of what was required in the scope?
Not that I know of.
Council, you're not aware of any deposits made, or earnest deposits made?
We received no money.
Mr. Chair, Council, or excuse me, Ms. Boa, you are the one who stated that the Attorney General has a special assistant assigned to this particular case to examine the issue of whether the 2013 acceptance, was there an acceptance of the RFP? Is that how this is that the right terminology? Or whether that's valid still? Any idea when that, perhaps when the AG's opinion might be coming out to determine whether that 2013 is still in play?
No, I don't know when there's going to be any activity on this. We haven't had any discussions with anybody on any of this activity since we terminated all this.
Okay.
We've just been sitting back waiting for rules, but in anticipation that we were going to have some, we were making plans to begin meeting again, but we never did.
Okay, but it is interesting to note, though, Mr. Borja, that at least in this folder, and I didn't bring this folder, I'm looking at, I believe it was, I'm not sure where it's from. Probably Mariana's Variety. Oh, it is Mariana's Variety on 10/8, just this month, October 8th, 2015. there is a request for proposal for this particular piece, and I haven't really taken a look at the real fine print because it's in very small letters. But if there was nothing going on, and if we're still waiting the Attorney General's opinion, then it begs the question, why is there an RFP 14-002 out there from GITA?
Oh, that's the original RFP.
But it's on a newspaper dated. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I misread this. It seems that Senator Tom Atta's office actually requested this on 10/8/2015. But you're right. In fine print, the date of this is November 21st, 2013. I apologize for that.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Welcome. I just want to say that I was speaking with GSA, and he described this solicitation using the terms premature solicitation, in that it was issued and saying basically that the solicitation was issued with parameters, whatever was in place at that time. But if rules and regs were to be adopted today, those parameters may very well change. And so to think that the solicitation or proposals that were submitted in 2013 in response to a solicitation in 2013 will still be valid 2 years later, I think it's going to face some serious challenges. I recall specifically, Guam Power Authority came down here on one occasion to get approval for its bonds for an RFP that it had issued for, I believe, a 30-year lease or a 30-year contract with respect to an independent power producer to be able to purchase power from them for the next 30 years. And when they came down here, the simple question was asked, what authority did you have to solicit for a 30-year contract when you couldn't, when the law only allows you for 5 years? And so they went back to the drawing table, started all over again. And so if this was to go through and award it to, this offerer that responded to a 2013, I would dare say that there's going to be serious objections raised from the legislature. Ms. Finney, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yes, just to clarify.
Maybe if you could call the mic.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Just to clarify that it's not my understanding that anybody is waiting for an Attorney General opinion regarding this matter. It's my understanding that an attorney was appointed to handle this RFP and to address any concerns that might come up and through the process of the RFP, which is, it's my understanding it's still pending. And so I just wanted to clarify that there would be that there was somebody appointed, and that's GITA's counsel would have been appointed to handle particularly this RFP.
Mr. Bora, didn't you say that the Attorney General's office would give us insight in terms of whether this RFP from 2013 is still valid?
Well, I believe that's what this special Attorney General has been assigned for, or been selected to do, but they haven't come
And has that
across-
request been made to the Attorney General to specifically identify or to especially address that one issue of whether or not the 2013 RFP that went out is still valid? Right. I mean, in other words, I understand what the Attorney General's representative is saying, that yes, there will be legal counsel for you, and yes, there. But again, I was under the impression that there was a request of some sort, or by the Land Trust to the Attorney General to understand whether the issue of this RFP is still valid.
They identified an individual, an attorney who has been assigned to this.
Okay.
But
that
we-
specific question was never asked.
No, that question hasn't been answered yet, because all the settings of the play haven't been put up yet. We don't have any rules and regs in place. So pending those rules and regulations, then they have more information in which to base their decision and their opinion. So I'm assuming that's what we're waiting for, but we haven't been asking for anything. We're waiting for rules and regs. I mean, that's the whole reason why this solicitation came to a halt.
But it's being kept open.
Well, it's determined to still be open because that GITA, who is the issuer of the RFP, hasn't closed it, and they haven't received any opinion yet from the Attorney General based on any information, any new information that would allow him to give him that, make that opinion, such as having rules and regs in place.
I understand that in a September 2014 meeting of GITA, their minutes there discussed about the mistakes that were made in the issuance of this solicitation, and also at that meeting was discussed about the offerer's failure to pay the down payment for access agreement, I guess, to that whoever that chosen awardee is. So based on the information that at least this committee has received, it just seems that to even think that this offerer who responded to a 2013 solicitation will be able to be awarded 2 years later a contract based on that solicitation is just beyond me, and I'm just saying right now, I think it's going to face some serious objections if that goes through like that, as opposed to reissuing the solicitation with rules and regulations in place that will further inform that package. Does anybody else have any questions on Lajuna? Okay.
As I was looking over the scope of the project, there are some things that were very glaring, and as you're assuming we were to proceed with entering into a contract with this, in looking at the scope, what concerns me is that there is no sense of what the value is for the development of the property, for developing the master plan and putting in the infrastructure required for a future residential development. And what I found very peculiar about this scope of the bid is, in looking at one section, the offeror requirements, under coral extraction royalties, it's open-ended and it leaves the option of paying royalties from coral extraction on the proposer. And we're looking at a 5-year period. It assumes a 5-year period to complete the project. So in that 5-year period, there's no real gauge of how much mineral extraction is going to occur, the aggregate, what the value of that aggregate extraction is, how much is going to be paid over to the Chamorro Land Trust. And then when you look at what the value of the development is going to be, the project to develop the master plan and to put the infrastructure in place for residential, there's no way of even gauging if this is going to be to the CLTC's best advantage. And that's what concerns me, is it seems so open-ended when you use words such as the proposer will determine whether or not royalties from the extraction will be paid to the CLTC. It begs the question of really who is in the end going to have the greater gain from this sort of a thing, because you've now created a situation, and I know we've talked about, you've made a comment publicly about leaving an open pit. This will not leave an open pit. This will actually be terraced in such a way that it can be usable, but even that is a little questionable, knowing what the nature of coral pits are. It's like a residential development into hell, almost. I recall seeing one by the airport at the Beak Point. It's hard to imagine seeing what a coral pit is in Oka, by Ipao, up by the airport off of 10A. It's hard to imagine how you could realistically and reasonably put a housing development in that sort of a venue. But what I'm concerned about, though, is in looking at the scope and all of that, there really is no indication of value for value here, and where those checks are going to be, where the CLTC will actually benefit more from this sort of a project.
During the phase in which we were negotiating with the first offerer, we were very much aware and in control of what we felt they needed to contribute as far as royalties went. And that was a long, long discussion. And it wasn't for them to come, we had control of that, and there was discussion on how we could go through that. So we were looking out for the best interest of the Chamorro Land Trust in this respect. And again, I'll say, it's not a pit, it's not a quarry, it's an extraction to terrace out the lands, and that's what we were trying to do, and it was not going to take 5 years. This lease, or this agreement, was for 5 years, but we had no expectation that they were going to complete the whole project in 5 years. In fact, it looks like it's probably something that's going to be about 20 years long to do, because of the kind of work that we're looking to do. So that being in mind, we knew we could only go for 5 years. That's why we stayed with 5 years. And was it in the best interest for the Chamorro Land Trust and Gita to do it in 5 years? Absolutely not. It was not in our interest, because the company would have to extrapolate or amortize the cost of all their equipment only over 5 years, and that meant we would have less of a return. If it was for a 20-year period, they could amortize their cost over a 20-year period of all their assets, and that would give us probably a better return. So, we were trying to do it within the confines of the law, but we were also looking out for the best interest of the trust.
But just looking at the bid, though, I'm reading from 4.0 overview, page 15, where it states that the CLTC proposes a development agreement term of up to 5 years. So you're saying that that's no longer...
No, that's what the RFP is for 5
Right.
years. But our expectation was that it was not going to be a 5-year project. This was going to be something greater than a 5-year. There's no way anyone could do that in 5 years.
The just to put down the master plan and the infrastructure, but the residential we expect is going to be something that's a separate project apart from this one, correct? We're just talking about prepping the land.
We're just talking about prepping the land,
Right.
and then using some of that money that we receive from royalty to then go back in and create the infrastructure.
Under a separate bid and a separate project.
Or, well, yes. I mean, if they could do some parts of it, but the idea is we don't want to be stuck in a process where we lay down any kind of infrastructure that sits idle for a great period of time and corrodes and becomes unusable when we finally have to come around to try and use it.
But I can't imagine that this one bid would be a rollover into another residential development contract.
Well, no,
they're
I
two
mean, it's for
separate
5
things.
years. There would have to be another one.
Right.
I think you just said something very, very important, is that having realized that, a 5-year contract is just not going to be long enough for that investor to have recouped his investment in it, but it will probably require 20 years. Further lends, to the idea that this solicitation needs to be canceled now.
No, I didn't say that, sir. I said
No,
that,
you said
that
you-
they would that 5 years they'd have to amortize their cost over 5 years
Okay.
in order to make their profit.
Right.
But that means in the end we had less to be able to have come to the Chamorro Land Trust. If they had 20 years and were able to spread that cost over 20 years, there'd be a greater amount of money available that could come over to the Chamorro Land Trust. They were not going to do this job if they couldn't cover their costs in those 5 years.
So realizing that, why would we want to proceed with a solicitation that asks for a 5-year commitment, when we know that with a 5-year commitment, they're going to need to basically, there's probably going to be zero coming to the Tomorrowland Trust.
Senator, we had to think outside the box based on all the restrictions that we have to deal with. And the 5-year law that came into effect was one of the biggest limitations that we have to deal with. And we had to take it realistically and do the best we could, trying to think outside the box, trying to figure out a way to be able to process land to make it available so we can get affordable homes put into a place where there's a major growing population. And to do it in a way that doesn't affect the aquifer when we do have residents living atop the land.
Okay. Anybody else?
I've been a little concerned this whole evening. We keep talking about there was no procedures, no rules and regulations. Does the Chamorro Land Trust have any rules or regulations as to how it does any of the leases?
There is rules and regs for the agriculture and residential that is incorporated as part of the law.
And the rules and regulations as it relates to residential, how we have 8,000 applicants. I noted, thank you for your response to my FOIA request the other day. I noted that we have about 2,500 people that have actually received residential lots. How are they selected?
Today, they're selected by their place in the queue and when they signed up. And that's how I expect it to be done, and that's how Mr. Moffness prior to me had also done, because some had been selected outside of that list from that queue. They had jumped the line in the queue to be given some. So we're trying to accommodate the people who are ready to, that are next in the list.
Thank you very much, because that was the thing that I wanted to get. That they were supposed to be their place in the queue. What years were you acting chair of COTLC?
Probably 2013, 2014.
Would it surprise you that during that period that about a dozen leases were issued to residential people that were way out of the queue?
Not knowing what your 12 people are, I today have given out agricultural or residential leases to individuals that are well outside that queue because, number one, they were either a previous land use permit holder or a Department of Agricultural lessee or someone that had been an occupier of the land and was confirmed by their respective mayor as occupying that land prior to the incorporation of this Chamorro Land Trust Commission. Those would be the reasons why we would probably entertain those individuals to be able to assume the lands. And we have to have record of those kinds of activities when we do give that approval for those
okay,
leases.
so then I probably should do a FOIA for all of those documents, because in my review, Mr. Chairman, this commission from 2011 issued 358 new leases, 340 leases over the last 5 years. And once I went through all 8,000 and we made our own Excel spreadsheet, I was able to get a listing of just the application dates and then compare the application dates to the dates that they were issued. And I discovered that there were about 44 lessees that applied after 2001. I mean, after the year 2000, who have received leases in the last 10 years, the last 4 years from your commission. And more disturbing, there are over a dozen whose applications dates were 2011, 2012, 2013, who received property in leases. And so I guess I'll have to FOIA to determine how they came to the front. But are any of these people that are on this lease of people who received land in the last couple of years, who applied in the last several years, any members of the cabinet or any government officials?
That have received land recently?
Yeah.
I suppose there may be.
If I were to go through this list, would I find that immediate family members of cabinet members would have been recipients?
I'm not sure, sir. Has anyone asked me to give any preference to any individual? No. No.
And so just so that the record's clear, Mr. Chairman, that I found 44 who applied after 2000 who received leases since 2011.
And for those reasons I stated before, when we come up across people, and some of these are occurring, individuals who have been preoccupiers of the land, who had never signed up for a lease, but they're there, we have to take that into account, and they're requiring utilities, and there's no other way to get them legally on the property but to get them a lease. We do those. They have the documentation to prove in almost all these cases, I'm sure. I mean, that's my expectation, sir. When I have those leases come to my desk, the first thing I do is I look to see when the application date was. That's the first thing I do. And if it's something outside of 1995, I need to see a justification why it's happening. If there's a land use permit in there or a mayor certification that they've been living on that property since prior to 1994, then that's the justification that I need. And the reason when we discover these individuals, and we do find them, we tell them, you're on this property and you need to be legitimized to be on there. And there's more of those kinds of folks we need to deal with. So we get them signed up so we can get them into the lease process, so that they're legitimately there because they've been there, their water got disconnected, they can't get reconnected because they're technically not legally on the property. And so we face those kinds of issues. I'm not going to tell someone that they can't have their water and they've been living there. I'm going to do what I can to get them their water. But I have to also be strict about how we do this and how we go about doing it, because I have made I've spoken with Waterworks directly and said, look, we're going to do our best to make sure these people are legitimate. They have a concern about that as well. They have a financial concern that they're not hooking up people to some place that they may not have legal right to, and that's their concern. And so I'm trying to assist them in that respect as well. But to deny people water because they failed to because they got cut off because they failed to make a payment, and now they've become current, but they have to go through the reapplication process and they need a utility authorization from the Chamorro Land Trust. That's the kind of stuff we're facing on a daily basis, where we get clients who are coming in because they've had this issue. I have a host of more of them. There are people who have been assigned way before our time to unregistered property who technically have no lease. We can't even do a survey for them because you can't record a survey on unregistered property. But they're there. They got homes. And so I have to find a method to be able to have a document that shows that this is where their piece of property is, this is who they are, and then we have to document those guys and get them in the system as well. So we have to live with the realities outside of this lease, this application sign up as well. But we're doing our best to do what we can to make sure that we honor the integrity of the people who, of the queue that was established.
No, I mean, 300 of them had 1995 dates that you guys issued. I was just a little concerned about the 44
Right.
that I discovered that had 2000 and 2000 up to 2013 application dates.
And there might even be a 2015 if we find a person who is fallen out of the system, never signed up, but they've been there, and they come out of the woodwork and come to us, especially when they're in need of something, and then we find that we have to deal with these people, and so we do. We get them signed up, and it's because they were already there well before. And like I said, there's gonna be others out there. There's a whole lot of other people who were there on the property well before the Chamorro Land Trust Commission came into play. And they're still there. There are communities of people out there. And I have to deal with them and legitimize them because they're not even on the tax rolls to be able to pay property taxes because they don't have a lease. But they've been there since the 70s. So I have to find a way to deal with these kind of folks, get them signed up, and you know what? They may not even be of Chamorro descent. But I have to deal with what was given to us and what was allowed to happen back in the 70s. And that's the truth, sir.
Okay. Now, that wasn't the focus of this. I just was trying to get to rules and regulations, and I will issue a separate FOIA to get the justification for each one of these.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
I just have one final question, and that is about how much how much revenue are you getting from commercial leases right now, those that have been authorized?
You know, sir, I don't have that number off the top of my head right now. I can get you that number.
Okay, but whatever that number is, what's it all being used for? Strictly for operations?
Probably so. We when a payment comes in, it's assigned to a Chamorro Land Trust account when it's deposited into the Treasury of Guam. There's nothing that's specifically earmarked for any specific thing, not like what we're trying to do today where certain activities will be earmarked towards infrastructure or surveys. Nothing is done. So we do put in a budget that has a request for certain activities, and supposedly it comes out of that fund site.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any other questions? Senator Spaldon?
I do, but I don't have it in my head right now.
Okay, Senator Torres?
As long as we're talking about commercial leases, is there any issue with the zoo?
Yes, there is. They've been begging to have their lease renewed. But I can't do it because I don't have any rules and regs. That was a creation of a public law, but they've expired a couple of years already. But they have been doing their honest good best to come in, asking all the time, can we please proceed to get another lease again? And so we haven't gone.
Their expiration date, would it have been before or after the expiration date of the golf course?
Probably before. But they don't have any other options to renew on their existing lease. They've met the max that was given by the public law.
That is a fact, Mr. Chair. I have seen the lease, and there is no option to renew under the public law that gets deeded into this property or lease this property to them.
And I would love to give them a new lease. In fact, their property will be on one of my proposed lists of commercial properties that will be presenting to the legislature some date, because I'm looking at all these current uses of land that has existing occupants on it, some whose leases have expired, some whose leases may not have even been done, that we need to legitimize. But I've had to all tell them, I can't even talk about this until I have rules in place so I can begin to do these things. But I am working on all these property lists of existing commercial activities that we need to get approval on. And I'll be providing a list as well of some others that we propose. And some of them won't be any surprise. There'll be things like Lajuna. But those are the ones that we'll be providing. And it's not a major list, but most of it is going to be from what's existing out in the system right now. But I'd love to help out with them. I mean, she came to the Rules and Regulations public hearing one day because she was concerned, and that's how concerned she is. And if she's come to see you, senators, then She's coming in because she wants to be able to still continue the operation of a zoo that provides a public service to school children and, gives them a livelihood.
Mr.
But
Borah,
it's their passion.
may I ask then? I mean, I think we all would like to help them out, but under the rules that were submitted, by now I'm sure you've seen the rules that has been introduced in bill form. Would those rules provide the legal mechanism for Chamorro Land Trust to be able to do that, or would it have to go out to a total bid and have them compete
that's
with
a
other
good question,
commercial
Senator,
enterprises?
because how do you do something like that to an organization that's already sitting there and say, I want to rebid to these guys? You really can't. There's another one. It's a solid a metals collection facility. It was established because of the debris that was created following 2 significant typhoons over a decade ago. And they've got a good operation going. They're providing a valuable public service to this island. But do I go out and have to do an RFP with them? That's not fair. I mean, how do you, and somebody else comes in and takes over? So there's got to be some consideration to some of these activities that are currently existing that are quite unique. And I don't have a starting point on anything if I don't have any rules.
Well,
And at least
that
we
was
can
the
move
question, right? In the rules that you brought before us, right, that we eventually disapproved, did it provide for these type of situations that we could consider? Because moving forward, the bill that Senator Atta introduced regarding the rules, there are some things that are missing, and you commented on them at the public hearing. The question still remains, do the rules that you introduce or the rules that Senator Atta has on the table, do they encompass a mechanism to be able to address these kind of situations without having to go out and compete against the big boys? In the case of the Cushings, I think those of us who have been here for as long as we've been here for know how it all started, and they've always been at that location, just a family, and they eventually developed it into the zoo because of their love for the environment and the animals. And back then, when the original lease was given, even before the 20-year lease, I believe that they had, there was an agreement, I think, with the Rendu at a certain point. And again, they've been doing this throughout the years. So the question still begs, do the present rules, or do the rules as proposed have a mechanism to address this, or do we need to try to figure out a mechanism?
Probably need to figure out a mechanism.
And do you have anything in the back of your mind that might help these kind of situations?
Well, probably just a simple sentence in there that gives an opportunity, even if it's through a legislative request and a legislative approval for specific individuals like the Cushings to be able to continue operations with an extended with another lease, and then to proceed forward, because the rules and regs give us other opportunities to be able to create that lease, the restrictions, the terms, and all those kinds of things. But maybe perhaps we need to come up with a list that says, here are the specific individual cases that need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Any idea how extensive this may be? Are we talking about a handful? Are we talking
A handful.
We are talking about a handful.
Yeah, just a handful.
Mr. Chair, that might be something worth at least taking a look at, because we need to address this from the start, just to make sure that if we are intent on seeing if we can help them, since they've been there for decades, then perhaps that list of a handful of entities should be made available to us. And I'm hoping you can maybe provide us with that list, Mr.
I have.
Mr. Thank you.
I will.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, going back to the renewal of the lease for the golf course, I just want to be clear. Are we going to be? Can we expect Mr. Borja to get the documentation then on the transfer of ownership?
That's what I had been. Yeah.
Okay.
I
And
said yes.
then I noticed too that the lease has been recorded already with land management, and they've been paying according to the lease, and they've made payments all up into 2015. This was executed in 2014, but will you also be, with legal counsel, be looking into that question about the fair market value and what the rents ought to be, because it seems very clear from, in my opinion, looking at the plain language of the original lease, that the start was based on the fair market value. So you would presume that, you know, the fair market value, now that it's been readjusted, it restarts the base. And I would expect, I know that you've got something in place, but I think in the best interest of the Chamorro Land Trust and the people of Guam, that would be the correct course to take, to reevaluate that and perhaps look into not renegotiating, but perhaps renegotiating and amending this to be fair. Is that something that we can expect you to take up with the Chamorro Land Trust Commission?
Well, I will take it up too with legal counsel as well to determine whether or not we can do that to an existing lease. So
you can always amend the lease. You can always amend the lease.
We can always amend the lease, but when it comes to the terms and the costs, I mean, those are usually the items that don't get discussed unless it goes down. So we'll take a look and discuss that amongst
okay,
ourselves.
and then if I may also, perhaps you can also consider whether you can, if you're going to amend it and go into renegotiation, if you can perhaps shorten the terms. Because that then gives you, short of defaulting, that gives you the option of not granting the election to renew a lease.
Okay, we can look at that.
Matter of
I
opinion,
think there's a
but
whole
it just
year in
makes
law
sense.
school on contracts, so you know that can be very, very tight. But we'll take a look. We'll have some discussions with them as well.
Thank you.
Senator Underwood?
Yeah, just one question, Mr. Borja. You know, relative to the Lajuna project, was there any kind of environmental or archaeological study that was done before, you know, as the project was being considered?
Is this Lajuna?
Yes, Lajuna.
No, there wasn't, and that was what the part of the process was supposed to be about. In getting their permits, they have to do all that. So that was what the idea of that access agreement I spoke about earlier, that we ended up also terminating because they didn't provide a deposit.
Thank you.
And I think that area also, because it's untouched, there's many protected species up there, certain types of trees and indigenous trees and that. So that also has to be.
There's an adjacent property to the south of that that's been used by an individual who's there now. His uncle has been farming that area on several of the terrains, and you know we're beginning to look at some. We're getting some requests, and we're going to be entertaining some of these requests to take some of these areas and and declare them as a conservation easement. There's some areas in there that are valuable because of the species of trees that are and plants that are in there that are
tree,
quite
I believe.
unique.
Yeah, the
in
ephod,
fact,
I
in
think,
this
is up
one
there.
area a little further south, the conservation people have even been are kind of like the idea that there's been a lot of poachers there because there's very few signs of feral pigs, and that's what's allowed a lot of the plant growth to get, you know, for a lot of the plants to be growing in there. And the Surahanos have been coming through too to kind of look around for the omelet, and they kind of appreciate and would like to see something like that because there's some one-of-a-kind plants that might be in that area. So we're beginning to look at some of these areas here, maybe even the Marble Cave, the Pagat Village area as a conservation easement.
That's good to know. Thank you for sharing that.
Mr. Borja, since we're talking about this piece and now we've gotten to the conservation issue and all those, I guess the question then begs, we're talking about 404 acres. Is that necessary? Is that the size necessary?
No,
for
we're not
a
going to
quarry?
use all 400. In fact, there's a terrace there where it drops down. We weren't going to go beyond that. We're going to. In fact, it's probably
About how many acres were they looking at for if they were
well,
going to do
you can see the
quarry?
ridge line coming from the north to the south, and that would probably, if you can imagine it through there, would be something definitely to the beach area we wouldn't even touch. But
So-
it's
Is this the ridge line here?
right.
So, a ballpark estimate, out of the 404 acres, the 1.6 million square meters,
Well, you know, that was...
How big of a query are we really looking at?
Right, you know,
for
that's why
terracing?
that whole master plan as part of the RFP was for them to give us an idea of exactly how they would use this. And there would definitely be areas that they were looking at to just be open area that wasn't even part of the, you know, because if you do have a subdivision, you have to have certain elements inside there for parks and recreations and whatnot, and green areas. So, you know, we were looking at that, but that was part of the RFP, was to give us a concept of what they were going to use, how they were going to develop it. But it wasn't going to be for that entire lot. That was by far much larger. I mean, that's the size of the lot that we're going to use, you know, that we're looking at, but that's not necessarily the amount of space we're going to use.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Yes.
Just one thing, Mr. Chairman, there seemed to have been not a meeting of the minds as to what the appointment of the Special Assistant Attorney General was. Would it be possible to get the appointment letter?
Sure.
Specifically stating what that person's supposed to be doing? And that way we all know what
Yeah.
the intent was.
Well, yeah, I'll check with Gita, because it's through Gita.
It's through GITA that the arrangement was made that the Attorney General's office would represent the Chamorro Land Trust. Is that how that works, or are they working with GITA, who has their own legal counsel, or how does that work?
They were working. It was GITA's counsel, because GITA actually issued the RFP, not the Chamorro Land Trust.
Right. But in terms of the assignment of a special an assistant attorney, right, an attorney to assist Chamorro Land Trust, is that how this works, or is it was an attorney to assist GITA in the preparation and the following and the legal issues with the RFP?
It was just, my understanding was that it was specifically for that RFP.
And it was for the RFP in working with GITA, as basically the MOU gives authority to, I guess, negotiate on behalf of Chamorro Land Trust. Is that how this works?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, if there's no further questions, I want to thank you very much. And I want to, you know, I also want to recognize the fact that your office has been very cooperative in responding to the questions and the requests for information. You've been certainly very responsive to that, and I want to say thank you for that. It certainly makes the job of the committee a lot easier. Thank you very much for that. And if there's no further questions, then this Committee on Lands will hereby adjourns this public hearing, and the time is now what time is it? 8:52? 7?
6:52.
6:52.
2 hours.
Oh, wait a minute. Here. I knew I was missing something. 6:52. Okay.